We hope you're enjoying Spirit of Aviation Week. We continue our programming today on Stream 1 at 2 o'clock, the Fun and Affordable Flying Panel. Learn how you can own and fly a fun and affordable airplane for less than the price of a used car. Our panelists include Ray Johnson, who owns an Aranca Chief and a Mooney M20, Lynn Dawson, owner of a Cessna 172 and a Globe Swift, John Hoffman, owner of a Piper J3 Cub, and Jacob Palmer, who owns an Aranca Chief. Then at 3 o'clock on Stream 2, EAA's Mark Force and Joe Norris present a sheet metal workshop. Remember, all event times are Central Daylight Time. For a complete schedule of events, please visit eaatogether.org. And remember, you can always enter to win our daily giveaways. Just share your Spirit of Aviation Week photos using the hashtag EAATogether and tag @EAA to your Instagram or Twitter post. You'll automatically be entered into a random daily drawing. Thanks for watching.
Hi, I'm Alex Udrus with Bold Method. My business partner, Colin Cutler, today is behind the scenes, as always, running the cameras and the switchers today. And today we're going to talk about 3 common landing errors. These are errors that I make all the time, and it really doesn't make a difference how long you've been flying. I think landing errors are something we always like to talk about because they keep coming back. So if you're a new student, if you're just getting into aviation, if you're getting close to your solo, or maybe you're getting close to a check ride, and you're going, man, you know, the one thing that really frustrates me is landings. Well, kind of get used to it. It's something you'll always be working on. But B, also keep in mind you're in really good company, because everybody's been working on their landings at some point in time, and that comes back over and over and over again. It has lots to do with proficiency. The more you practice them, the more you do them, the better and the more comfortable you are with them. And in fact, for me, I know when we're doing a lot of filming that involves takeoff and landings, when I'm really working the pattern hard, they really start to feel second nature. And then it always seems that we move off onto a lot of cross-country operations where I'll just make, 1 or 2 landings a day, basically on a straight in, maybe like an ILS instrument approach, and I start to feel that proficiency go away. And so, one of the tough things about it is you've got to keep practicing them to make them feel really good. So today what we're going to do is talk about 3 common things that people see that go wrong with landings. We're going to talk about how to diagnose them and how to solve them. And throughout this presentation, if you have any questions, throw those out in chat. Colin will put them up on the screen and we'll be able to go over them there. This is much better as an interactive presentation. You don't want to hear me lecture on for an hour. So don't wait till the end. If you want me to go into more detail, if you're experiencing a specific problem, throw it out in the chat and then Colin will work it in. Okay, so first of all, we're going to start by just quickly reviewing the flare and the round out. We're going to talk about what's happening there, both with our control forces and with aerodynamics, and we're going to explain how that sets us up for, ideally, the perfect soft touchdown. Once we've gone through that, we'll talk about how to judge our flare height. I think this is one of our most common questions. People ask us this all the time. And then from there, we're going to talk about floating. I think that's probably the most common landing error, overall. And then we'll take a look at ballooning. And again, if you want to go into, if you want us to go into depth on a specific example, if you want more information, just throw that out in chat. Okay, so from there, let's jump in and take a look at what's happening during the flare or the round out. We'll jump to the iPad. Okay, so what's going on in a flare is essentially the airplane is going to smoothly transition from a stable descent all the way down to touchdown. And what we're trying to do is touch the aircraft down with the minimum descent rate, okay, so basically barely descending at all and right at your stalling speed. Okay, so what we're doing, again, is we're transitioning from a high rate of descent. Okay, we're going to start to pull that descent back, and at the same time, we need to slow the airplane down. And all of this is happening essentially through the amount of lift that the aircraft's generating. So there's two things to think about, right? When we talk about lift, we also need to talk about induced drag. Remember, there's two different types of drag. We have drag that's caused by lift. The more lift the airplane generates, the more drag it generates. Okay. And then we also have drag that's what we call parasite drag, caused by the shape of the airplane, that's form drag, the friction of air flowing over the materials, like over the wings or over the fuselage, that's skin friction drag. And then finally, what we call interference drag, when different streams of air flowing along the airplane start to collide, maybe at angles like where the wing joins the fuselage or in braces in a Cessna 172 on the wing braces, that creates drag as well. We call that interference drag. That parasite drag really doesn't change with lift. It changes with airspeed. But when we're flying slow, when we're talking about round out and landing, flare and landing, really induced drag is our largest drag factor, and that will go up as we start to generate more and more lift. So going back to the iPad, essentially what we want to do here is use lift. We're going to increase the lift more and more and more. That's going to start to slow down our descent rate. So you'll see the airplane, as we start to approach the ground, we're essentially increasing that lift. I'll play this out. We're increasing that lift up and up and up, and that slows down our descent rate. But at the same time, increasing lift generates more and more induced drag. So our throttle during the round out and flare is at or near idle. When we're flying a light training aircraft like a 172 or a Piper Warrior or an SR-20 possibly, you'll find that that throttle is basically all the way at idle as we do the round out and flare. In a heavier airplane, maybe a Cessna 206 or a Piper Seminole twin, you may find that you have a little power still in until the aircraft touches down. But again, that power is almost all the way to idle. So we can't slow down really by pulling the throttle back any further. The only way the aircraft is going to slow down is by generating more and more induced drag, and that drag is going to bleed off our airspeed. And again, we want to touch down right at our stalling speed. There's a couple reasons for that. First of all, one of the biggest is the slower you touch down, the easier the aircraft is to control when it's on the ground. Okay, airplanes are meant to fly. They're not meant to high-speed taxi. And if you think about it, most of us are training initially in a tricycle gear airplane. It's like riding a trike at high speed on the pavement. You know, if you go back to think about that, it gets really unstable the faster you go. Okay, so the airplane is much easier to control at low speeds on the ground. So we want to touch down as slow as possible. It's also better for the tires, and it'll use the least amount of runway distance as we roll out. So if we touch down right at stall speed, oftentimes the runway is long enough we don't even need to use brakes. The aircraft can just gently roll to a stop. We're at a walking speed, so you can turn off the runway. So again, it's really important that we touch the airplane down right at about stalling speed. Another big advantage is your nose is pointed up, right? You're in that landing attitude. You have a higher angle of attack, and that means you're going to land on those main gear first, and then you'll transition to bringing the nose gear down. If you're landing fast, you have more airspeed, so you're at a lower angle of attack, and the airplane is going to touch down more flat, which means it's hard to land on the main gear first, and you have a chance of three-pointing it, which in a tricycle gear airplane you don't want to do, or touching down nose gear first. Okay, looks like we've got our first question.
Yeah, we get a question in from John, and he wants to know this. How high above the ground should I start my flare? Said I fly a 172 and I feel like I don't flare soon enough.
Okay, great question. You know, the interesting thing for almost all light aircraft, and when I say light aircraft, I mean, reciprocating engine, singles, and light twins, we're going to start our flare at about the same height, and that's about 15 to maybe 20 feet above the ground, roughly the height of a single-story hangar. The problem is we don't always have those hangars in our field of view. But let's take a look at that. I think I got a shot here, so you can see if we look out at this is in Steamboat. If we look, this single-story hangar here is probably 15 to 20 feet high. And so right about the height of that roof, that's where we want to start our flare. The challenging thing, again, is that, at a lot of airports, there are no single-story buildings right next to the runway. So using those buildings to judge our flare height can be a little bit difficult. So there's an easier way. What we want to do is watch the edges of the runway out our peripheral vision. Okay, so notice I'm talking about peripheral vision. That's a really important point when it comes down to landing. We're used to focusing on things like aiming points or looking at the buildings, looking at obstacles. But when we land, we really want to use our peripheral vision to help us judge both our height and the aircraft's attitude. Okay, so let's take a look. You can see this is us coming into land at Steamboat Springs, and I want you to watch how the edges of the runway grow in the windscreen as we start to descend down. What you're going to notice is the runway grows at a very steady rate in the windscreen. And as the runway right here at the edges, which would be about as close to our peripheral vision as we can get in a video, as the runway starts to get close to the edges, all of a sudden you're going to see it start to really quickly expand. So it's going to grow very, very steadily out, and then all of a sudden it kind of zooms. It's going to blossom up to fill the windscreen. When that runway zooms, that's the point at which you're about 10 to 15 feet above the ground, or 15, maybe 20 feet above the ground. That's where you should start your flare, once you see the runway really seem to bloom out in your peripheral vision. What we've got here is a meter that will show you how fast the runway is growing, okay? So when it stays small, it means the runway is growing really steadily. As the rate of growth of the runway increases, you'll see it slide out and fill this bar. That means the runway's growing really quickly in our peripheral vision, and at that point, that's where we should start our round out and flare. We'll watch this a couple times. So let's start here. You can see the aircraft's descending down, and the runway's growing fairly steadily. And then right there, it really speeds up. That's where we should start our round out and flare. Let's watch that again. So we'll go back from the very beginning, and what I want you to watch is how the edges of the runway really quickly fill this section of the windscreen. It'll grow out fairly steadily to here, and then it really grows out quickly right as it reaches the end. So here it's growing steadily. We're still coming down to flare height, and right there, that's where you see it quickly grow. That's where we should start the round out and flare. There are a couple things that make this a little difficult to pick up initially. Number one is oftentimes we're fairly focused on our aiming point. And when we're focused on our aiming point, when our eyes are basically, maybe we're aiming at the 1,000-foot markers or the aiming point markings, when our eyes are focused out there, it's really hard to see things in our peripheral vision. So when we're flying, or when we're getting close to our round out and flare, one of the things you really want to watch is that you transition your eyes from the aiming point and up to the horizon. And so what you're going to see here, this is kind of what we're looking at, our focus point. I like to try to aim for the aiming point markers normally. It's where the VASI or the PAPI will lead me in. And normally, I have more than enough runway to roll out to an easy stop without even oftentimes using brakes if I touch down on these points. They're usually 1,000 feet from the beginning of the landing area of the runway. And what you'll notice here is as this kind of light area widens out, I'm shifting my view from those aiming point markings up to the horizon. That makes it much easier for me to start to see in my peripheral vision the growth rate of the runway.
And Alex, right before you start here, I'm just going to hop in because Jennifer had a question about exactly what you're talking about. And I'm not even going to put it up because you're already in it. But she said, when I start my flare, where should I look? When should I start looking down the runway?
Okay, so as you get close to that point, as the runway starts to fill your windscreen, that's when I'm going to raise my eyes up, Jennifer, from the aiming point markings or whatever my aiming point is, and I'm going to start looking at the horizon. So as I start to see that runway fill out my windscreen, essentially I'm moving from the aiming point up to the horizon, and at that point in time, I'm watching the horizon to watch the aircraft's attitude, essentially bring that nose up into the landing attitude, and that depends on both your seat height and the type of airplane, but usually the nose is right about the horizon or slightly below it. And then I'm just going to hold that landing attitude and use my peripheral vision to kind of monitor both the edges of the runway to see when they really start growing, and at the same time make sure I'm not drifting left or right. So you should be able to see that here. We'll go back to the iPad. You can see as we start to approach that, notice how right about the point the runway fills the windscreen is when I started looking up. And now I'm just going to hold this landing attitude and wait for the airplane to touch down. We'll watch that one more time. So again, you'll notice I start looking up to the horizon right about the time the runway gets to the edges of my peripheral vision, or really starts to fill my peripheral vision. So I'm coming in here, and that's where I start to lift my eyes up to the horizon. And that's now I'm going to hold that landing attitude until the main gear touches down. One of the things that can make this a little bit difficult is if you have not found the comfortable seat position yet. What I mean by that is, obviously in a lot of airplanes, not only can you adjust the seat forward and back, but you can adjust it up and down, and in many airplanes we can adjust the recline, right? And this seems pretty trivial. But I don't know if you've gotten into your car after someone's maybe repositioned the seat and nothing feels quite right. Well, it's even worse in the airplane, because not only does it feel foreign, our movements on the rudder pedals are going to feel different. The way we hold the throttle and the yoke or the stick feels a little bit different. But at the same time, our sight picture is different. And so one of the things that really complicates landing is it's entirely a visual maneuver. Okay, we practice lots of visual maneuvers out there, right? Steep turns, stalls, slow flight. These are all visual maneuvers. But at the same time, we're back and forth to our instruments and then outside as we execute them. But as you get into the round out and flare, your attention is nearly almost always outside. Okay, you're basically 100% outside at that point in time. As the aircraft touches down, you're focused outside. And if your seat's high or low, if you're moved forward or back, even a little bit, even one notch on one of those seat pins, if you're slid back one notch, the vision, your sight picture will look completely different. Because again, we're only talking about maybe a thumb's width or a couple fingers width. That's the difference between the cowl and the horizon. And when you move that seat forward or back, you could easily add another inch to that picture. So it's very important that you find a position of the seat that's comfortable for you, that allows you to smoothly move the control yoke, allows you to smoothly move the throttle, get to all the switches, allows you to feel comfortable on a long flight, so your legs aren't cramped. You can fully push the rudder pedals to the travel and then stick it there every single time, because that's how you build that sight picture. If you're changing your seat position, it gets harder and harder and harder. The other thing to think about, as we get stressed, we tend to hunch forward, okay? We get aggressive, our muscles tense up on both the power and on the throttle, on the yoke or the side stick, and we tend to start to lean forward. We're no longer sitting back in the aircraft's chair. And again, just moving forward that 6 or 7 inches is enough to start changing the sight picture. Things will start to look different. And it can be hard to recognize that. It just it feels different subconsciously. So I always tell people, as you're landing, you want to be relaxed. And I know that's kind of it's an easy thing to say, hard thing to do when you're working on landings. But one of the things to remember is, imagine you're holding a tennis ball between your shoulders and pressing it back against your seat back. That will keep your shoulders back. It keeps you leaning back against the seat, and it makes you more relaxed. What you don't want to do is to start hunching forward in the seat. It destroys your sight picture. It tends to allow you to tense up on the controls, and it makes your movements significantly more jerky. And we'll talk about that a little bit more as we get into aircraft ballooning. Let's take a look at a couple other things here. One of the things that can be difficult to judge is in a high or a low flare. So let's take a look at that. We're coming back into Steamboat today, and I want you to watch where the aircraft starts its flare and how wide the runway looks. So as we come down final here, I'm at my correct final approach speed. I'm descending down towards this aiming point here, but I'm going to start my flare a little high. I won't wait for it to zoom and fill the windscreen. So I'm starting it right here, and you can see how wide that runway looks. Okay, now let's take a look at it flaring a little lower. So you can see now I'm still descending down, but look how much wider the runway looks in the windscreen. And you'll notice it led to a fairly flat touchdown. So that's one of the challenges. When you flare high, you can easily run out of lift while you're still too high above the ground. And you'll reach that perfect stalling speed with minimum descent, but oftentimes you still have a foot or two or even more underneath the wheels, and the aircraft can touch down hard. Not only can it be a tough landing on the main gear, but if you're high enough, the nose will start to drop and you can land on all three, or you can land on the nose gear first, which can cause it to collapse. So the danger of a high landing is, even if you time that round out perfectly in terms of speed control, the airplane's got a lot of room to drop. On the other hand, a low flare, you have a tendency to touch down flat, which means that you can easily touch down on the nose gear first, and you typically can't get the airplane all the way down to that critical angle of attack. You can't get it to the stalling speed, and so the airplane will typically touch down fast. And again, it is all a visual reference. The thing that makes this tough is as you move in between wide runways and narrow runways. Let's say your home airport's got a 75-foot wide runway, and you go out to a airport with major airline service, and you're dealing with a 150-foot wide runway or a 200-foot wide runway. That's going to change that visual perception. Okay, so the wide runway essentially is going to make you feel much more close. Okay, you're going to feel lower than you actually are. And if you're used to training on a wide runway and you go to an airport with a narrow runway, you're probably going to end up delaying your flare too long. So that's why if you think about, okay, if I'm learning to fly and I'm struggling to feel comfortable landing at different airports and different runways, part of that is the fact that the runway widths are different. And so because those widths are different, the sight picture is different. And that's where I tell people, go back to just waiting for that runway to kind of blossom out in your peripheral vision. Because no matter how wide the runway is, if you wait for it to kind of zoom out, and that's how you're picking up your landing flare timing, that'll work on any runway. And if you're having a hard time seeing that, it can be a little bit difficult to pick up sometimes when you're flying on the controls, because we're focused on so many different things. You're focused on holding a landing attitude. You're focused on your final approach speed. You're focused on directional control and killing a crosswind. You're focused on where your throttle is. All of those things can make this process a little bit more difficult because you're managing so many different things. So let your flight instructor fly a little bit. Have them go through and execute this maneuver, do a landing several different times, and then you can just sit there and watch out the front and see what's happening. Practice moving your eyes up to the horizon and watching that runway width change in the windscreen. That can help you develop that sight picture because you can just simply think about that. Sometimes taking everything else out of the equation makes it much easier to learn how to recognize your landing attitude. Okay, we've got another question.
Okay, Bob wants to know this. He says, often when I get to what I perceive as that 10-foot flare point, I take a quick glance out the left side, the left window. Is this considered acceptable? And then he says, I adjust my flare accordingly at that point.
Absolutely. One of the things to keep in mind is that we still need to maintain a scan pattern when we're on final approach. And so you'll be scanning inside to airspeed, outside for your landing attitude, watching with the peripheral vision. If you glance out the left or the right side, depending on where you're sitting, to check your aircraft's alignment or look at the edge of the runway, there's nothing wrong with that. However, what you will find is as you really begin to recognize that runway width change in your peripheral vision, you won't need to look out the left or right side to judge your height anymore. You'll just start to pick that up with your peripheral vision. It'll become something you naturally recognize. And that's also one of the reasons why I tell people you want to practice this often, because it takes a lot of time to develop the sight picture. And if you let yourself go a couple weeks without flying, that sight picture starts to go away. And so this is something that really benefits from a lot of repetition. Something also to think about. When we're on a training flight, oftentimes we practice landings at the end, right? You go out and you do a whole bunch of maneuvers, you come back in, and that's when you practice landings. The problem is, especially on a long flight, bumpy day, middle of summer, you're tired by the time you come back. So if you're really frustrated with the landings, you can't seem to quite get that visual reference set, think about doing your landing practice before you head out to the practice area. There's nothing wrong with taking off, staying in the pattern, flying, several landings, touch and goes or stop and goes, and then going out to the practice area to practice maneuvers. You're going to be a little bit more fresh. You've got more energy. You haven't been beat up by thermals yet. You're not hot and dehydrated. It makes it easier to focus on the landing. So if you're struggling with that, if you feel like, every time I come back to the pattern, I'm already exhausted and I'm having a hard time picking this up, do your landings before you head out to the practice area, and it can make it a little bit easier to recognize. Okay, Colin, looks like you got one more question.
No, I just, I'm typing over here, working with people and forgot to turn the light off. So I'm going to turn that light off and let you keep going.
Okay, let's take a look at the next thing. And in this case, we're going to talk about float. So when we talk about landing attitude, and we talk about transitioning that airplane down to touchdown, we really need to time the altitude, but we also need to perfect that final approach speed. Because there's two things that are happening, right? We're slowing down our descent rate. We're doing that by increasing the aircraft's angle of attack, generating more and more lift, which decreases our descent rate, and generating more and more induced drag, right? Lift-based drag, which is helping us slow down. If we approach the flare too fast, we're going to end up essentially holding a lower angle of attack, not reaching that critical angle of attack, waiting for induced drag to bleed off all of our speed. Okay, so when you look in your pilot's operating handbook, you may find that the aircraft has a range of final approach speeds published. So like when Colin and I were teaching in the Piper Warrior out at UND, there was a graph that you would use based off your aircraft's landing weight to figure out what your final approach speed should be. When we started flying the Cirrus SR-22 and the 22 Turbo, we found that the manufacturer publishes one speed, and that's our final approach speed or our short field landing speed at maximum gross weight. The thing is, we rarely land at maximum gross weight. And even if you use that chart to compute your final approach speed, if you're using your takeoff weight, keep in mind you'll be several hundred pounds lighter as you're exercising the pattern. In fact, most of the videos you see here are from our Mastering Takeoffs and Landings course, and I would spend a couple hours in the pattern at Steamboat while Colin was filming this. And through that couple of hours, the aircraft would get lighter and lighter and lighter, and so I would have to change my approach speed to be slower and slower and slower. So that's something to take into account. If you're flying final approach too fast, the aircraft will always float, and you only have one thing that you can really do to fix it, and that is to wait it out. Now hold that landing attitude and wait it out. Part of the reason it's so difficult, you feel like you float along so long, is because our drag profile changes when we're right over the runway. So let's take a quick look at this. I'm going to show you what's happening. So what you can see here, coming off your wingtip, these are your wingtip vortices. You'll notice right now they're fairly large. What happens is, as air generates lift by flowing over this wing, some of the air comes around the wingtip, right? And that spirals outside in. And you'll notice, if you look at this black line, this is our relative wind. It's the airflow passing over the wing, and you'll notice that it starts to bend down. Well, when the wing is generating a lot of lift, these vortices are very strong, and they start to create what we call downwash. The interesting thing is lift is always generated perpendicular to that airflow over the wing. The relative wind is what we call that. And so if you were to look at, normally, you'd imagine that your airflow would be something like this, and so lift would point straight up. But when we're generating induced lift, or when we're generating lift due to the pressure difference over the wing, which is all of the time, and even more so as we're coming into land, these wingtip vortices actually start to bend the relative wind down. So now, as opposed to the wind being like this, it's much more like this. And that means our lift starts to point backwards. Okay, so as we're increasing our angle of attack, as opposed to the lift pointing straight up, and I'll draw this out here, the lift actually starts to point backwards. And if you look at that, you end up with this little section of lift that is effectively pulling backwards. That little section that you see there, That is essentially your induced drag, okay? That little section of lift that is pulling backwards is really what we would consider to be induced drag. That's how you find that. So, what happens as we get close to the ground? Well, as the aircraft starts to descend, you'll notice the ground starts to interfere with those wingtip vortices. So as we get closer, these wingtip vortices get smaller and smaller and smaller because they're limited by the runway or the pavement, okay? And as that happens, you'll notice they no longer have the same effect on the wing's downwash. The downwash starts to point essentially more and more horizontal. And watch what happens to this lift vector here. It starts to point more towards straight up. So essentially, as we're arriving over the runway, as we're planning on using induced drag to help slow the airplane down, those wingtip vortices start getting smaller and smaller and smaller because they're limited by the ground, and we start losing induced drag. The airplane becomes more and more efficient. Lift starts pointing up, drag starts going away, and so if we've approached on final, if our final approach speed is too fast, the challenge is we have less and less induced drag to slow us down. Now there's definitely still some there. Plus we have parasite drag. So the aircraft will continue to slow down, right? It just doesn't slow down as fast. And this makes any extra speed on final approach even worse. It's one of the reasons why people tend to feel like the airplane can float for a long time once they get into that landing attitude. They feel like that airspeed indicator just won't slow down. And that's because you've lost a lot of your induced drag. Okay, we've got another question.
Jim wants to know with this, what you're showing here, he says, is what's happening here ground effect?
That's exactly right, Jay. This is ground effect. And you know, the wingtip vortices that you see here are the same thing that produce wake turbulence. What you're seeing as you float down the runway is the aircraft essentially losing drag in ground effect. And that's why the airplane just wants to keep going. It's lost a lot of its induced drag, and so it can't slow down. So there's a couple of things that we can do, first of all, as the aircraft starts to float. Number one, you really can't, the best way to fix a float is to slow down your final approach speed. So really, if the aircraft is floating significantly, I'd execute a go-around, take it around the pattern, and slow your final approach speed down by a knot or two. Even if you've calculated a final approach speed. If you spent 45 minutes in the pattern, you've probably chewed up a significant amount of fuel. The airplane is significantly lighter. So take a knot or two off that final approach speed and see how the aircraft reacts. But if you're floating just a little bit, you can oftentimes kind of manage it and still allow the aircraft to land. And to do that, what we want to do is just simply hold our landing attitude. Okay, so you'll see that here. I've come in just a little bit fast in this case. I'm already about to my round out, and I'm at 80 knots, but very light. So 80 knots is Cirrus's recommended final approach speed at maximum gross weight. It's really 80 to 85, but for a short field landing, they say 79 knots in our aircraft on short final. So we're a little bit past that. Plus, I am significantly below maximum gross weight. I've probably got 40 gallons of fuel on board, and it's just me. And so because of that, the aircraft's really going to want to float. What you're going to see me do is just hold the aircraft's landing attitude. So what I'm going to do is keep the nose in a constant position against the horizon. And this is a little bit more challenging here at Steamboat because you have to kind of imagine where the horizon is because we have mountains, but it would be right about there. Essentially, I'm just going to keep my nose in a constant position against that horizon, and I'm going to wait until the aircraft starts to settle down. So let's watch that in play here. I start my round out. That's my aiming point. I'm floating, and notice I'm just going to hold my nose right here until the aircraft lands. Let's watch that one more time. Okay, so I start my round out. That's my aiming point. Now watch, I'm just going to hold my nose right about there, and I'll actually draw an arrow you can kind of see. My landing attitude shouldn't change too much until we touch down. So the secret with a float, okay, if it's just floating a little bit, if you're only a couple knots too fast, is to hold that nose in the landing attitude and just wait it out. Wait till your main gear touches down. Now, as the aircraft starts to slow down, you're going to need to apply more and more back pressure. Okay, so you're going to keep increasing the pressure on the stick or the yoke to keep that nose in the landing attitude. But the process is very, very gentle. If you get aggressive with it, it's easy to cause a balloon. We'll take a look at that in the next section. At the same time, you also want to make sure that you don't end up floating too far down the runway. And so, obviously when you're working on a check ride, when you're working on your private or your commercial, your ATP check ride, you're going to need to stick that landing right about the touchdown point, okay? Not much further from that. You never want to land early, and you have a fairly short tolerance to go beyond it. So what that means is as I transition my nose, or as I transition my eyes up to the horizon, I'm tracking my touchdown point in my peripheral vision, okay? I also have another point that I've selected on the runway, and this is my I need to touch down by here point. Okay, so let's take a look at your ground landing roll. The Cirrus SR22 Turbo, we're typically between 1,300 feet to 1,500 feet of ground roll at maximum gross weight depending on our density altitude. So let's just assume our ground roll is 1,500 feet. Now, in reality, I probably can't stop the airplane in 1,500 feet. It's with max braking, non-contaminated runway, perfect tires. Chances are I'm not going to hit that number. So for safety, let's say I double that. So I take 1,500 feet times 2. Now we're talking about 3,000 feet of ground roll. What I'll typically do is look at an airport diagram, and I'll walk back 3,000 feet, or twice my ground roll, from the threshold or the end of the usable runway distance. And then I'll find some sort of visual reference that says, okay, if the airplane isn't down by here, maybe it's a taxiway turnoff, maybe it's a windsock or a recognizable hangar. If the airplane is not down by here, I'm going to execute a go-around. That way, I always have a visual reference that I'm tracking as I float to make sure I don't float too far. If you start going through accident and incident reports, you'll find quite a few cases where a pilot approaches too fast, tries to float the airplane out and touch down, and touches down too far down the runway without enough distance to stop. So typically, if I'm working on something like if I'm practicing point landings for a certificate or a rating, I'll actually measure out 200 feet or 400 feet, which is generally 200 feet, 2 stripes, it's about 2 stripes. Stripes aren't a standard distance, but they're usually about 100 feet or 150. 400 feet, 4 stripes. Okay, if I go further than that, then I'll go around. If I'm floating because I'm landing in challenging conditions, maybe crosswinds that are changing, and I'm just going to play it out and hold the aircraft over the runway until I'm ready to touch down, I'll monitor that don't land beyond here point to make sure that I never run out of room as I'm rolling the airplane out down the runway. Okay, a couple other questions we get all the time, and that is, do high wings float differently than low wings? And the answer is, the wing doesn't have that much to do with it, but it does have a little to do with it. And high wings behave a little bit differently in ground effect than low wings, and that's just simply because the height above the ground is different. So we'll take a look at the iPad here. If you look at this is a Cessna 172, okay? And if you look at that wing, it's probably a good 6 feet off of the ground. In a low-wing aircraft like our Cirrus SR22, that wing is significantly closer to the ground, maybe 2.5 feet. And the interesting thing about ground effect is its effects get exponentially larger the closer you get to the ground. So that extra 3 or 4 feet does make a significant difference when you're talking about the changes to the wingtip vortices. So you can see, going back to the iPad, as the 172 starts to approach the ground, you'll notice it still has kind of full strength vortices, whereas the low-wing airplane, the ground has already taken a big effect on the wingtip vortices. So what that means is a low-wing aircraft typically will experience more ground effect. You'll notice less induced drag on a low-wing airplane than you will on a high-wing airplane. However, I always tell people, you need to take that with I wouldn't say a grain of salt, but just take it carefully, because it's not the only thing in the equation. if you're to have a high wing airplane and a low wing airplane with the same aspect ratio wings, kind of the same parasite drag profile, with the same engine and the same propeller, then you really may notice the wing location making a big difference in the aircraft's tendency to float. But as you start to go into heavier and heavier airplanes, that oftentimes has more of effect than the wing location. So for example, you'll probably find a Piper Warrior or a Cherokee may float more than a heavier Cessna 206 or a 182, especially like a turbo 182 with a big engine up in the front. Those airplanes, even though they have high wings, they have large engines, more weight. The propeller actually absorbs more energy from the air when it's at idle, and so those airplanes tend to float less. So what I'm really getting at is this. When people say, should I learn to fly in a high wing versus a low wing? I've heard low wings float more, high wings float less. It really depends on the specific model of airplane that you're flying. The wing position itself doesn't have the majority of a factor when it comes to float. Okay, looks like we've got another question.
Yeah, we got a question that I think is going to fit in well to the speed control here, and it's this. In very early hours of flying in a Cessna 172, I fell victim to several wheelbarrow landings that were very anxiety-provoking, understandably so. Could you say a few words about the cause and the correction for a wheelbarrow landing?
Okay, that's a great question. So there's a couple things that can cause an airplane to wheelbarrow. When we talk about a wheelbarrow, and I don't have a model airplane with me, but essentially what's happening is, as opposed to landing on the main gear and then allowing the nose to touch down, in a wheelbarrow landing, the nose touches down first, oftentimes with the main gear off of the ground. And so what's typically happening here is the aircraft is still flying too fast. We haven't actually gotten to our critical angle of attack yet. So I'm going to jump back to that first slide on round out. We're just going to take a look at angle of attack here. Colin, if you want to jump back to the iPad. Perfect. So you can see what's happening. In this case right here, the aircraft's descending. Okay, we still have a flight path like this. You'll notice that the nose gear is lower than the main gear. And what we're trying to do in a round out is increase that angle of attack. You'll notice even right here where we have a small angle of attack, but a positive angle of attack, that nose gear is still below the main gear. And really, we need to bring the aircraft up towards the critical angle of attack so that nose gear is significantly higher than the main gear, and the aircraft can touch down on the ground with its main gear first, and then the nose gear can gently come down afterwards. So when the aircraft is wheelbarrowing, one of the cases is we're just simply touching down too fast. We have not gotten the aircraft slow enough that it's actually at that critical angle of attack. And so that means one of two things. Number one, our final approach speed is too fast. This is possibly one of the most common reasons, and part of it is just simply that we're afraid oftentimes of flying slow on final. Those published approach speeds can look pretty darn slow. So a lot of people will add significant airspeed onto it. That just makes it more and more likely for the airplane to wheelbarrow because you're going to be at too low of an angle of attack, possibly even a negative angle of attack over the runway, which means you're going to touch down on the nose gear. So getting that correct final approach speed so that the round out can lead to touchdown right as you hit the critical angle of attack, that's really important. The second problem is oftentimes just recognizing that landing pitch attitude, understanding where that nose should be in relation to the horizon. And that's a hard thing, again, to develop because you have to sit in the same seat position and focus outside over and over and over again so that you can recognize where that nose should be. And that's one of the things that I notice the most now. I really don't have to look around or even inside the cockpit very much. Just the sound of the airplane and the position of the nose on the horizon is what I'm looking for to tell me that the airplane is ready to touch down, because that nose position has been so ingrained in my mind after thousands and thousands of landings in the airplane. If I change aircraft, it takes time to develop that sight picture again. So when you're new, if you find that you have this tendency to land flat, part of it is you haven't developed that sight picture yet. It also could be that you're staring at that aiming point too much. If you're focused on the aiming point, you're not using your peripheral vision, it is very difficult to judge your landing attitude. So getting your eyes up to the horizon, looking out there, and then recognizing that landing attitude, knowing about how far below or above the cowling should be against the horizon, and then just kind of putting it there visually will help you from wheelbarrowing an airplane. The other thing that you can find is wheelbarrows can easily happen after a bounce. And so we talked about float, right? We talked about how if the aircraft's floating down the runway, essentially what we need to do is hold that pitch attitude right against the horizon and landing attitude, gently bringing our back pressure in as the aircraft slows down, going around if we've chewed up too much runway, and waiting for the airplane to touch down, otherwise waiting for it to touch down in the main gear. But if we get too aggressive during the float, if we start to get tense, it's easy to apply too much back pressure. And let's take a look at that. So in this case, this will run into a balloon, which can easily turn into a bounce. So what you're going to see here is I get a little aggressive with my back pressure, and you'll notice that the aircraft starts to climb back up. The first place you'll pick this up is out of your peripheral vision. You'll notice that the runway starts to move in a little bit. The edges start to close in. It takes a little while to recognize it out the front. It's not as perceptible. But if you're using your peripheral vision to monitor the sides of the runway, you'll notice they start to pull in. That's the first sign of a balloon. So you'll see that here. So I'm floating, and I added just a little too much back pressure there, and you could see the sides of the runway change. We'll watch that one more time. And again, just kind of watch right here. You'll see them move in, and then they'll start to come back out as I descend back down. That's them moving in, and then they move back out. And you'll notice that they don't change very much. You want to try to catch a balloon early, where really the only sign is your peripheral vision, the edges of the runway starting to pull in just a little bit. If you recognize a balloon there, you can oftentimes fix it without going around. By the time you see it out the front and you really feel that runway starts to get smaller, oftentimes you've ballooned too much and you don't have enough room to safely fix it. You need to take the airplane around. So let's take a look at an animation. You can see what's happening. What you're going to notice is we get a little bit aggressive on our back pressure, and that's going to cause the angle of attack to increase too quickly. So here we come. You'll see that angle of attack quickly increasing. As that's happening, okay, we're generating more and more lift, so the aircraft is generating more and more induced drag, and the airplane keeps slowing down. The problem is we're no longer at the proper flare height, okay? We're actually higher. So we've bled off airspeed throughout this maneuver, but at the same time we've increased our altitude. And so now we need to try to continue to keep that descent rate low as the aircraft descends down towards the runway, okay? But we don't want to get to the critical angle of attack too early because that could cause us to hit hard or bounce. And so you'll see that here. Going back to the iPad, we're stuck, increase the angle of attack a little more, and if we run out of angle of attack, we get to that critical angle of attack too early, our descent rate will get too high, the aircraft can touch down hard. In some cases, if the aircraft balloons high enough, it will actually start to drop the nose as essentially recovering from a stall, and you could easily touch down on the nose gear. So the first thing is we want to catch a balloon very, very quickly. And when we do that, you're going to see the edges of the runway pull in. When that happens, the first thing you want to do is just hold the aircraft's back pressure right where you had it. Don't move the stick forward. Don't continue to move it back. Just hold the pressure right where it is and allow the aircraft to settle. If you don't change back pressure, if you don't increase it at all, you won't continue to increase the aircraft's angle of attack. So eventually it will just start to settle back down. And as the aircraft starts to settle back down, and you can see in your peripheral vision, the runway start to get a little bit wider in the windscreen, at that point you can continue to keep increasing the back pressure to hold the aircraft in the landing attitude. But as the aircraft starts to balloon, just stop adding back pressure, wait it out, then as it settles back down, gently bring the back pressure back in to keep the airplane in the landing attitude. If you need to, you can add a little bit of power. But if you need to add significant amounts of power, it means the airplane is ballooned way too high. and you need to take the airplane back around again. Especially in heavier airplanes, Cessna 182s, 210s, the SR-22 and the turbo, adding a little bit of power during a small balloon helps you kind of cushion out that landing because the power will help reduce your descent rate. But again, if you have to add too much power, you're typically also going to start increasing airspeed, and the aircraft, it becomes very difficult to get the airplane back to that proper landing attitude. Okay, looks like we've got another question.
Yeah, Alex has got a question about these balloons, and he says, if I balloon too much, should I go around? And I'm going to add on to this, are there any guidelines or anything like that, recommendations you have for the point where you should go around?
So yes, first of all, one of the things that I tell people, especially when we're learning to land, is as you start to end up in these errors, practicing a go around is almost always a great idea. And that's simply because, it gives you a chance to set up again and to solve the problems early. Trying to manage the problems as you're floating down the runway gets to be a little bit difficult. So taking the airplane around is a great solution. You can, if the airplane balloons just a little bit, you start to see it in your peripheral vision, but you really can't see the runway dropping away ahead of you yet. It's just that you start to see it change out here. In that case, you can usually fix it. And the guideline is, again, if you really see yourself climb, if you can notice it out the front, you've ballooned too much. If you just start to pick it up in your peripheral vision, you're just climbing up a little bit, then you can just hold the yoke where it's at, or your control stick where it's at, wait for the airplane to start to settle down, and then gently start increasing the back pressure to hold the airplane in landing attitude. If you need to, if you're flying a heavier airplane, maybe adding a small amount, a couple hundred RPM of power to cushion the descent down can help. But if you start to see the runway drop out in front of you, you can actually see it getting smaller. You're typically ballooning too high. And this can be very difficult sometimes to recognize. It's hard to judge the difference between just a little bit and too high. So in my mind, the way I kind of help recognize that is if I can see it happening in front of me, if I see that runway in front of me getting smaller, or I get that elevator feeling where the aircraft starts climbing back up again, that means I'm ballooning too much, okay? And in that case, I'm going to take the airplane around. But again, if I just pick it up out of the sides, I'll just stop my back pressure. Then as the aircraft settles down, I'll continue to add back pressure to hold my nose in its landing position against the horizon, keep the cowl in that landing position, and then allow the aircraft to gently touch down. Again, the other thing you need to think about in a balloon is how far have you floated past your touchdown point? So are you getting close to that point on the runway where you will not touch down beyond that? If you're getting close to that, you want to take the airplane around again. One last thing to show you, and this kind of goes back to that wheelbarrow, you want to be careful because if you balloon too high, the aircraft can lead to a bounce. And in this case, you're going to find there's some downward pressure on the tail that tends to greatly increase the angle of attack right after the bounce, increasing lift, slowing the airplane down even further, but now you're back up in the air. And this can lead to a stall in the middle of the bounce. We call that porpoising. I know you've probably seen some videos of that online. So one of the things to think about, bounces can happen from a couple of reasons. You can touch down just without enough of a flare. You can touch down flat and bounce the airplane. But if you balloon too much and you try to save that landing, you see it dropping out in front of you and you try to save that landing, you can lead the airplane to a bounce. It essentially hits that critical angle of attack too early. You don't have the ability to reduce descent anymore. You hit hard, but then the aircraft bounces back up already at a high angle of attack and way too slow. And so now you're generating more lift and more drag, slowing down even more, and you'll find the aircraft's nose wants to come down and it's easy to land on the nose or wheelbarrow. If the aircraft bounces, especially if it bounces from something like a balloon, okay, you ballooned up and you come down, you have you can feel it touch down and it's a little harder landing and you come back up, the best solution, really the only solution is to take the airplane around, execute a go around. Because you've bled off so much airspeed and you're at such a high angle of attack, it's easy to stall the airplane down. Okay, I got the red light on, so it means that we're out of time. I really appreciate you joining us for this. We're going to be resuming Bold Method Lives here soon, so watch the Bold Method webpage and our YouTube channel. We'll let you know when those show back up. And hope you enjoy the rest of EAA's Spirit of Aviation Week. See ya.
Spirit of Aviation Week streaming is brought to you through the generous support of Dynon Avionics. Learn why more than 20,000 pilots already fly behind Dynon